I pulled into my driveway that morning, only to find it completely buried under mountains of snow, every inch shoveled and piled there deliberately. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe a rogue plow or a neighbor being careless. But then I saw the HOA's unmistakable mark, a neatly stamped warning left on my door, claiming I'd violated community standards. My blood ran cold. They weren't just enforcing rules, they were targeting me. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't about snow at all. How far would they go to assert control, and what would it take for me to fight back? Life in Cedar Pines had always felt peaceful. Quiet streets lined with manicured lawns, kids riding bikes, and neighbors greeting each other on morning walks. For me, it was perfect. I had spent years turning my little house into a cozy sanctuary, planting tulips in the front garden, repainting the fence, and even customizing the driveway to fit our small family's needs. Every weekend, I'd sip coffee on the porch, watching the sun catch the frost on the treetops, feeling safe and content. The HOA, a group of well-meaning but controlling neighbors, usually operated in the background. Their notices were infrequent, mostly reminders about lawn height or trash day, but they always carried a subtle weight, a reminder that nothing in this neighborhood was truly yours. I'd paid my fees, followed the rules, and never imagined being singled out. Then, subtle signs started. A terse note about unauthorized driveway modifications appeared one morning, tucked neatly under my doormat. At first, I shrugged it off, thinking it was a misunderstanding. But then neighbors began to whisper, glancing at my driveway as if it were some scandalous offense. The HOA's presence, once invisible, began to feel suffocating. I didn't yet know how far this tension would stretch, or how petty grievances could escalate into full-blown battles. I only knew that a storm was coming, and it wasn't the kind that came from the sky. Something about my driveway, something about the rules they enforced, was about to push our quiet street into chaos. Little did I know, the next snowfall would become the battlefield, and what seemed like a simple shoveled path would ignite a war I could never have predicted. At first, I tried to shrug it off. The HOA's note about my driveway seemed minor, just another bureaucratic quibble in a neighborhood obsessed with perfection. But it didn't take long for the subtle harassment to turn into something much more aggressive. The following week, I received a formal letter threatening a fine, not for neglecting the rules, but for unsightly deviations in concrete width, a rule no one had ever enforced before. My heart sank. It wasn't just about the driveway anymore. It was about power, control, and the way a few people could dictate life in my own home. I started noticing the HOA's presence everywhere. Their inspectors seemed to appear whenever I was outside, measuring the slope of my lawn, taking photos of my mailbox placement, even timing how long it took me to remove the trash cans from the curb. Every small action became suspect, a violation waiting to happen. Neighbors who once waved hello now offered strained smiles, as though they feared aligning themselves with me might invite scrutiny. The fines began to mount. First a small $50 notice, then $150, then $300 for what felt like nonsense. Each letter was more formal, more threatening, more meticulous in its legal phrasing. I started spending nights poring over the HOA's covenants and bylaws, trying to understand how such arbitrary rules could be enforced. The deeper I dug, the more absurd the regulations became. Restrictions on the angle of the mailbox flag, prohibitions on certain decorative rocks, exact measurements for shrub spacing. The minutiae was suffocating. One evening, after shoveling the driveway following yet another minor snowfall, I found my car blocked by a neighbor's SUV. The driver claimed it was an accident, but I knew better. A note on my windshield read, "Driveway modifications are still not compliant. Enforcement action pending." That was the moment the harassment felt personal. This wasn't enforcement, it was intimidation. I tried reason. I emailed the HOA, explaining that my driveway had been legally installed, that the slight angle deviation was minor, and that I had never received prior complaints. I begged them to reconsider, to clarify their expectations. The reply was cold, impersonal, and firm: compliance is mandatory. Further violations will result in additional fines and potential legal action. They weren't listening. They were asserting dominance. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the neighborhood thickened. I caught glimpses of the HOA president across the street, clipboard in hand, surveying the lawns, whispering to other neighbors. I felt constantly watched, as though stepping outside my door without permission could trigger another confrontation. My mailbox became a daily source of dread, each letter a potential dagger of new fines or threats. And then came the storm. A blizzard hit the area, dumping nearly a foot of snow overnight. I woke to a beautiful winter scene, only to find the next morning that my driveway had been completely buried, not by nature, but by deliberate action. Snow plowed from the street had been piled high across my property, leaving no access to my garage. I stared, frozen with disbelief. The streets were clear, my neighbors' driveways accessible, but mine? A mountain of white blocking every exit. I called the HOA office immediately, hoping for some explanation. The receptionist's tone was polite but evasive, as if she were reading from a script. "We're aware of the situation. Compliance officers will review the matter." Nothing was done. My calls went unanswered. I was trapped, physically and emotionally, by an organization sworn to maintain fairness, yet wielding its authority like a weapon. Over the next few days, I discovered more evidence of targeted action. Security camera footage from my front yard revealed a small convoy of HOA personnel shoveling snow directly from the street and dumping it across my driveway while a few board members watched from the edge of the road. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't even negligence. It was intentional harassment. I felt rage boil inside me, mixed with a helplessness I had never known. But I wasn't ready to surrender. I began documenting everything meticulously. Photographs of every plowed pile, timestamps of every notice, recordings of conversations with HOA representatives. Each act of harassment became ammunition, each absurd fine a testament to the overreach of authority. I started consulting local ordinances, talking to lawyers, and even reaching out to neighbors who had quietly suffered under the HOA's strictures. Some admitted they'd been too scared to speak up, fearing retaliation. My sense of injustice grew into determination. This was no longer just about my driveway, it was about standing up to systemic abuse. As the snow melted, I attempted to clear my driveway again, only to find another note, more threatening than the last: "Non-compliance persists. Enforcement action imminent." I realized the HOA wasn't just targeting property aesthetics, they were testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push me. Every attempt to restore normalcy was met with another challenge, another obstacle. The tension in my household escalated. Every trip outside, every chore on the property felt like walking into a battlefield. Then, an unexpected twist. One morning, a neighbor quietly approached me with a stack of old HOA meeting minutes, revealing that several board members had previously voted themselves special privileges, exemptions from rules they now enforced on the rest of us. It was petty, vindictive, and blatant abuse of power. The realization hit hard. The rules weren't about community standards at all. They were about control, about making me bend to the whims of a small, emboldened clique. With the storm still fresh in everyone's memory, and my frustration mounting, I began planning my response. I didn't want confrontation for confrontation's sake. I wanted justice, a way to expose the absurdity and hypocrisy of the HOA's actions while reclaiming my home. Every day, as I watched my neighbors casually clearing their driveways, I sketched strategies in my mind. What leverage did I have? What tools could I use to turn the tables? How could I make them see that their petty rule enforcement had crossed a line? The tension reached a peak one cold morning when I received the final warning, a letter threatening legal action if the driveway was not brought into compliance immediately. I held the envelope in my hands, trembling with a mix of fear, anger, and resolve. This wasn't just bureaucracy anymore. It was personal. And I knew that whatever came next would decide the outcome of this escalating conflict. Every neighbor interaction, every phone call, every footstep on the snowy street became part of the story. I felt both hunted and determined, cornered but ready. The battle lines had been drawn, and soon, the quiet suburban street would witness the most dramatic chapter of the conflict, one that no one would forget. And in the back of my mind, one question echoed: how do you fight an invisible army of rules and regulations when every step forward seems to invite retaliation? The day I decided to act, I woke up before dawn, a quiet tension humming in my chest. I had spent weeks meticulously planning, coordinating with city officials, and rallying support from neighbors who had quietly suffered under the HOA's relentless oversight. This was not impulsive. This was strategy born from frustration, careful observation, and a simmering sense of injustice that could no longer be contained. The first sign of change came when the sun's pale light hit the frosty street. The snow that had long blocked my driveway from the last blizzard remained, a jagged white barricade mocking every effort I had made to reclaim normalcy. But today, the driveway would no longer symbolize oppression, it would be the stage for a reckoning. I made my first move quietly, almost imperceptibly. A single call to the city's public works department, explaining the unusual situation, led to a rapid response. Within the hour, a convoy of city snowplows rumbled down our street, engines growling, their headlights piercing the soft morning fog. My heart raced as I watched the massive machines position themselves strategically in front of my house. The spectacle alone drew neighbors to their windows, murmuring, curious and confused. Meanwhile, the HOA board had convened, unaware that I had set the wheels in motion. They arrived, clipboards in hand, intent on delivering another fine or notice, expecting their usual compliance. Their expressions froze when they saw the plows lined up like an armored convoy, ready to clear every last inch of snow that had been deliberately piled across my property. Their whispers of authority faltered, replaced by the stunned realization that their power had limits. As the first plow pushed through the blockade, a wave of triumph surged through me. The snow cascaded off the driveway like a waterfall, revealing the smooth concrete beneath, my home, finally accessible once again. I watched as the other machines methodically cleared the rest of the street, creating a clear path not just for me, but for the neighbors who had been trapped, restricted, or intimidated by the HOA's petty rules. The visual impact was dramatic. The convoy was a spectacle of order restoring balance, a literal plowing through of oppression. The HOA tried to intervene. One board member, face flushed with anger, stepped forward to demand that the plows stop, citing supposed violations of neighborhood regulations. I held my ground, calm but firm, presenting the city-issued clearance permits and proof of their harassment. Their usual threats, those carefully worded ultimatums, dissolved under the weight of legality and public visibility. For the first time, I saw fear, a crack in the carefully maintained armor of authority they had projected for months. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the noise and the drama. They murmured support, some whispering confessions of their own grievances, others simply watching in awe. The HOA's influence, once omnipresent, was shrinking under the scrutiny of a community that had witnessed the absurdity of their actions firsthand. My small act of defiance had become a public spectacle, a turning point where private harassment collided with public accountability. The emotional intensity reached a peak when I confronted the board directly, not with anger, but with documentation, photographs, timestamps, and legal citations that left no room for argument. Every letter threatening fines, every photo of snow deliberately dumped across my driveway, every record of petty enforcement actions was laid bare. The culmination of months of meticulous record-keeping became a weapon, a force impossible to ignore. I could see it in their eyes. Shock, disbelief, even a flicker of humiliation. The board members had relied on anonymity, on bureaucratic distance, on the intimidation of rules and regulations that were meant to control rather than protect. But now, in the glare of early morning sunlight and in front of the entire neighborhood, their power seemed fragile, almost laughable. As the last of the snow was cleared, a moment of stillness fell over the street. I stood on my driveway, looking at the mess they had created, now transformed into a clean, clear path. The air seemed to hum with quiet vindication. I wasn't just reclaiming a driveway, I was reclaiming agency, dignity, and the understanding that authority is meaningless without accountability. Then came the final, surreal twist. One of the plow operators, a local veteran who had quietly observed the HOA's petty reign for years, turned to me and said something that summed up the absurdity and the triumph. They won't know what hit them. It was both literal and metaphorical. The snowplows had erased the barricade, and I had dismantled the illusion of untouchable control the HOA had built. I watched the board scatter, retreating to their offices and homes, their clipboards clutched uselessly in trembling hands. The neighbors cheered quietly from their windows and porches, a small but significant victory for the community. It was surreal, almost cinematic. The quiet street transformed into a stage for confrontation, the clash of petty authority and determined resistance laid bare for all to witness. Even as adrenaline faded, the emotional impact lingered. I felt exhaustion, yes, but also an unshakable sense of triumph. Months of harassment, intimidation, and petty fines had culminated in a single, decisive moment where fairness and courage won. The Snowplows weren't just machines, they were symbols of resistance, of reclaiming what was rightfully mine. And yet, the climax carried its own tension. This was not a story that ended in a single day. The HOA could still regroup, appeal, or escalate. Legal battles could follow. But in that moment, the balance of power had shifted. The neighborhood had seen the absurdity, the pettiness, and the courage required to stand against it. And I knew, deep down, that the next moves, whether by the board or by neighbors inspired by what they had witnessed, would shape the community in ways the HOA could never have predicted. As I stepped back to admire the cleared driveway, one final thought crystallized in my mind. How far can petty authority go before it collapses under its own weight? The answer had begun to reveal itself that morning, and the next chapter would be about the consequences. The payoff, the justice, and the lessons that even the most controlling organizations must eventually learn. The Snowplows had cleared more than just my driveway. They had cleared the tension that had gripped our neighborhood for months. That morning marked a turning point, not only for me but for every resident who had quietly endured the HOA's petty rules and constant scrutiny. As the convoy rumbled back down the street, leaving a trail of cleared asphalt and astonished neighbors, I realized that the battle was far from over, but the balance had undeniably shifted. In the days that followed, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers and cautious congratulations. People stopped by to thank me, not just for reclaiming my driveway, but for showing that standing up against overreach was possible. Some confided that they had been too afraid to challenge the HOA themselves, worried about fines or social ostracism. Now, they saw that rules could be questioned, authority could be held accountable, and even the most meticulous enforcers were not untouchable. The HOA, predictably, tried to regroup. Board members sent letters attempting to reassert control, citing violations and procedural oversights. But this time, I was prepared. Every interaction was documented, every communication recorded, every absurd fine countered with legal citations and photographic evidence. They could threaten, intimidate, or post notices, but their usual tactics no longer worked. The power dynamics had shifted, and I had a growing arsenal of accountability to back me up. I also involved local authorities. A meeting with city officials confirmed that what the HOA had done, deliberately blocking access to my property, could constitute harassment and even trespassing. They advised that I could pursue legal action if necessary, though they emphasized that public exposure often achieved faster results in these cases. The city's support reinforced my confidence, and I realized that what had begun as a personal battle was evolving into a public example of standing against petty authoritarian control. Neighbor support grew stronger every day. Several residents approached me, asking for advice, sharing stories of their own small battles with fines over lawn decorations, mailbox angles, or the color of shutters. It became clear that the HOA's reign of community standards had affected many quietly, and my confrontation had opened a door for conversation and empowerment. Together, we formed an informal coalition to monitor HOA actions, discuss grievances, and ensure that rules were applied fairly, not selectively. The community that once seemed tense and wary was starting to feel cohesive and engaged again. Financially, I had to weather a small storm. The HOA attempted to levy additional fines, hoping to intimidate me into compliance. But with evidence in hand and support from neighbors, the organization's threats fell flat. A letter from my attorney, coupled with documentation of harassment, forced the HOA to withdraw the fines and issue an apology, though carefully worded, to avoid public scrutiny. For the first time, their authority had been questioned and publicly challenged, and they had no choice but to back down. The psychological impact was profound. For months, I had felt constantly surveilled, constrained, and anxious about every step on my property. Those feelings didn't vanish overnight, but each cleared path, each neighbor nod of recognition, and each bureaucratic retreat from the board rebuilt a sense of security and personal agency. I could finally step outside without glancing over my shoulder or fearing another arbitrary reprimand. The act of reclaiming my driveway had restored not only a physical space but a mental one, a reclaiming of autonomy and dignity that the HOA had tried to suppress. Beyond personal victory, the incident became a catalyst for broader change in the neighborhood. At the next HOA meeting, turnout was unprecedented. Residents, emboldened by the visible success of standing up to harassment, attended to voice concerns, demand transparency, and propose amendments to overly restrictive rules. The board faced scrutiny like never before. Questions about selective enforcement, hidden privileges, and disproportionate fines were raised publicly. Some long-serving members quietly resigned, unable to maintain authority under the community's new, watchful eye. The small street that had once been tense and controlled by bureaucracy was beginning to feel like a real neighborhood again, connected, fair, and empowered. I also learned an important lesson about patience and strategy. I could have acted impulsively, shouted at the board, or attempted to clear the snow myself. But the measured approach, documenting, gathering evidence, involving city officials, and creating a visual spectacle with the snowplows, ensured that my actions were defensible, persuasive, and impactful. The HOA's attempts to maintain control unraveled not because of anger alone, but because methodical planning and accountability exposed their overreach. Months later, the street had changed in subtle but meaningful ways. Snow removal became standardized and fair, fines were scrutinized, and residents felt empowered to question new rules. The sense of fear that had pervaded the neighborhood was replaced with cautious optimism and a new culture of transparency. I often watched families play in their yards, neighbors chatting freely, and realized that the conflict had ripple effects far beyond my driveway. It had sparked a small revolution of accountability and courage. The HOA, humbled and more cautious, continued to exist, but their influence was tempered. Board meetings became more procedural and less personal, and residents began participating actively instead of silently obeying. The shift in dynamics proved that even small communities, often governed by invisible rules and quiet intimidation, could be reshaped when individuals had the courage to confront abuse and inspire. On a personal level, the experience transformed me. I gained confidence in my ability to advocate for myself, learned the value of documenting and strategizing in conflicts, and developed a deeper appreciation for the balance between community standards and personal freedoms. Every cup of coffee on my porch, every stroll down the street, felt like a quiet victory, a daily reminder that standing up to injustice can have lasting effects. The story also spread beyond the street. Word of the snowplow confrontation reached other neighborhoods, sparking discussions about HOA overreach and the importance of legal awareness. Some residents shared their own battles online, while local media briefly covered the incident as an example of citizen advocacy against petty bureaucratic power. It was surreal to realize that a personal struggle over a driveway had become a touchstone for others facing similar challenges. Looking back, the most profound impact wasn't just the visible clearance of snow or the retreat of the HOA. It was the change in perception, both for myself and the community. Where there had once been fear, there was empowerment. Where there had been frustration, there was action. And where there had been isolation, there was solidarity. The confrontation had reminded everyone that rules are only as just as their enforcement, and that communities function best when accountability and fairness are at their core. The final takeaway, the lesson that resonates most strongly, is simple yet powerful. Standing up to authority, no matter how entrenched, is possible when preparation, evidence, and determination intersect. Petty rules and overreaching power thrive in silence and compliance. Challenge them thoughtfully, and you create space for justice, dignity, and community. My driveway had been a battleground, but the real victory was reclaiming agency, not just for myself, but for every neighbor who had lived under quiet intimidation. As winter gave way to spring, I would often look at the clean, open driveway and the neighborhood beyond it. The snow was gone, but the sense of liberation remained. The HOA had learned its limits, the neighbors had learned their voice, and I had learned my own resilience. Life returned to a rhythm that was calmer, fairer, and infused with a subtle but powerful sense of victory. Even now, months later, the story lingers in my mind. I still see the morning of the plow convoy as a turning point, a reminder that courage and planning can dismantle even the most stubborn forms of control. And I wonder, if more communities recognize the dangers of unchecked authority, could we prevent petty disputes from escalating into months of harassment? Could we build neighborhoods where fairness, transparency, and respect guide action, rather than fear of fines or intimidation? In the end, my driveway wasn't just cleared of snow, it had become a symbol. A symbol of resistance against unnecessary control, of standing up when you feel powerless, and of the ripple effects one determined individual can have on an entire community. That morning, when the convoy rolled through, I didn't just reclaim my property. I reclaimed the story of our street, and the right of every resident to live without fear of arbitrary rules. And as I step onto the porch each morning, coffee in hand, watching neighbors chat and children play, I carry one thought that keeps the lesson alive. Sometimes the smallest acts, like clearing a driveway or standing up to petty authority, can change far more than just the snow in front of your house. They can change the culture of a whole neighborhood.